The winter of 1814 settled over the English countryside with a bitterness that seemed to echo the nation's exhaustion after decades of conflict. Fog clung to the narrow lanes of Brindlewick like a shroud, muting color and sound, and every cottage window glowed with the dull amber of candlelight as families huddled against both cold and fear. In these precarious months following Napoleon's retreat from Leipzig, suspicion traveled faster than truth. Even in small rural parishes, the mere whisper of a deserter or a spy could twist neighbor against neighbor. It was within this charged atmosphere that Eleanor Whitcombe, the apothecary's daughter, moved with subdued grace, carrying the fragile dignity her late father had instilled in her. She was 22, slight of frame, but steady of hand, accustomed to tending wounds and ailments without complaint. Though her eyes held the gentleness of someone taught to soothe rather than judge, they also carried a quiet loneliness, for the death of her father 2 years earlier had drawn an invisible veil between her and the rest of the village. They respected her skill, but regarded her solitude with equal parts curiosity and caution. Eleanor's days were simple, spent drying herbs in the shop's rear chamber, preparing tinctures to ease winter fevers, and offering remedies to the families who needed her. She did not consider her life remarkable, yet she cultivated a sense of duty that filled the silence left behind by her father's absence. What she lacked in companionship, she compensated for through small acts of compassion, lending medicines at reduced cost, delivering tonics to the elderly on harsh nights, and never refusing aid when someone appeared at her door after dusk. This quiet generosity, once admired, increasingly became a point of suspicion as the country's anxieties mounted. People muttered that goodness, when unguarded, could be exploited. More than one villager warned her that helping strangers was unwise in such uncertain times. On an evening weighted by frost, Eleanor found herself walking the edge of the common road, returning from delivering a tonic to a mother whose infant had taken ill. The fog had thickened like wet wool, muffling every sound but the crunch of cold earth beneath her boots. She had grown used to solitude after nightfall, comforting herself with familiar routines and the knowledge that fear diminished when one continued moving. Yet when a groan sliced through the stillness, raw, human, and unmistakably close, she froze. Her heart thudded as instinct and caution battled within her. After a measured breath, she stepped toward the faint sound, lifting her lantern to cut through the haze. There, slumped against the hedgerow, lay a man scarcely older than she was. His coat was torn, mud-stained, and stiff with dry blood. His face, pale beneath smears of dirt, contorted with pain as he attempted to rise before collapsing again. He carried no pack and bore the remnants of a once official uniform, though its insignia had been stripped away. He looked less like a soldier and more like a frightened boy who had stumbled too far from safety. Eleanor knelt, torn between prudence and compassion. She knew what the villagers would say, yet the tremble in his breath reminded her of every wounded man her father had once tended without hesitation. His eyes fluttered open, revealing a mixture of terror and pleading. With a steady voice, she asked only, "Can you stand if I help you?" He managed a faint shake of the head. Whatever his story, he would not survive the night untreated. Guided by an impulse she could neither deny nor fully explain, Eleanor supported his weight and helped him toward the apothecary's shop. He leaned heavily on her, each step strained with agony. When they reached the shop's back door, she ushered him inside and lowered him onto a cot used for patients requiring observation. She washed his wounds, cleaned the gashes along his ribs, and bound them with careful precision. Throughout her tending, he remained mostly silent, uttering only clipped murmurs of gratitude. Eleanor did not ask his origins, for she sensed that pressing him would worsen his fear. Instead, she offered water, warm broth, and a blanket, hoping rest might restore some clarity to him. But Brindlewick was a village perpetually hungry for news, and secrecy seldom survived long within its boundaries. A neighbor carrying firewood glimpsed a shadow moving through Eleanor's window and followed his suspicions to the constable. Rumors spread swiftly. A stranger at her shop, possibly a deserter, possibly worse. By dawn, the whispers tangled into conviction. Villagers gathered outside her door, lanterns in hand, voices sharp with alarm. Eleanor awoke to fists pounding upon the wood and voices demanding entry. The wounded man, upon hearing the commotion, tried to stand but collapsed again, shaking with dread. With urgency, she urged him to remain hidden behind the partition, promising she would protect him as best she could. When Eleanor opened the door, she was met with a sea of faces, farmers, tradesmen, and wives clutching shawls against the cold. Their expressions, once familiar, now bore a hardness she scarcely recognized. The constable stepped forward, informing her that a deserter had been reported fleeing through the region and that any person harboring such a criminal risked being charged with treason. Eleanor attempted to explain, insisting she had acted on instinct, believing the man a simple traveler in need of care. But fear, when fed by uncertainty, needed a sacrifice to quiet its unrest. Several villagers pushed past her, searching the shop until they found the wounded youth barely conscious. Cries of traitor and French sympathizer erupted, though the boy hardly looked capable of spying for anyone. The constable seized Eleanor's arm, declaring she had knowingly aided an enemy of the crown. Her protests were drowned by murmurs forming into shouts. With swift, merciless judgment, the crowd decided her fate should be determined publicly. Though Eleanor attempted to maintain composure, her pulse thrummed with dread as she was dragged through the muddy streets toward the market square. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and torches lined the path, carried by villagers who had once greeted her with warmth. She searched the crowd for a single sympathetic face and found none. The wounded youth was taken elsewhere, his fate uncertain, but hers seemed sealed. In the square, a rough wooden platform stood, typically reserved for punishing thieves or announcing decrees. Tonight, it had been repurposed for judgment. Lanterns swung in the wind, casting distorted shadows across the assembly. The magistrate arrived moments later, his expression resigned rather than authoritative. He cited wartime ordinances allowing immediate punishment for those aiding suspected deserters. Eleanor lifted her chin, fighting the tremor in her breath, and stated she had only acted to save a life. Yet mercy had no place in the minds of those who feared treachery more than conscience. The executioner approached her with grim solemnity, gripping an axe that glinted beneath the lantern light. The crowd quieted, awaiting the magistrate's final nod. Eleanor felt her resolve waver, but she refused to plead. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer not for deliverance, but for the frightened boy whose suffering had brought them both to this moment. The square held its breath as the executioner raised his weapon, poised to strike and satisfy the crowd's hunger for retribution. Before the blade descended, a thunderous roar split the tense stillness, the unmistakable surge of hooves bearing down upon the square. Gasps rippled through the assembly as a dark-clad rider burst through the fog like an apparition. His horse reared, scattering those nearest the platform. The executioner halted mid-swing as the stranger leapt from the saddle with a commanding presence that silenced even the boldest voices. Eleanor opened her eyes, bewildered, as the man strode forward, cloak billowing, gaze fixed upon her as if the world beyond her no longer existed. The crowd parted instinctively, awed by the authority radiating from him. When he spoke, his voice cut through the frozen air with unmistakable force, declaring that no blade would touch her while he drew breath. His arrival was as shocking as it was mysterious, yet something in his expression suggested that this was not the first moment their lives had brushed against one another. The executioner lowered his axe, and the crowd fell into stunned silence as the stranger stepped before her, placing himself between her and death. The square remained suspended in stunned silence as the stranger positioned himself before Eleanor, the fog wreathing his shoulders like a dark mantle. He was broad-shouldered, mud-splattered from hard riding, and carried an air of authority that required no introduction. Yet the magistrate, trembling, managed a bow before whispering, "Your Grace." The title rippled through the onlookers like a gust of wind. Some villagers dropped into awkward attempts at curtsies or bows, while others stared wide-eyed, as though uncertain whether they were witnessing salvation or calamity. The Duke of Ashcombe, William Hawthorne, turned briefly toward them, his gaze sharp with disapproval, before returning his attention to Eleanor. His expression, though composed, held a fierce protectiveness that unsettled her. She could not fathom why a man of his stature would intervene so decisively on her behalf, yet the intensity in his eyes told her the impulse had been neither rash nor indifferent. The magistrate, attempting to reclaim some semblance of authority, stammered that wartime ordinances allowed immediate judgment on those aiding deserters. The Duke countered with a calm, yet piercing tone, asserting that no decree empowered villagers to execute a woman without due inquiry. His voice bore the weight of lineage and responsibility, and the crowd's earlier fervor shrank beneath it. When he added that he would personally answer for Eleanor and assume custody of her until a proper examination could be arranged, the villagers murmured with a mix of disbelief and resentment. To challenge a duke was unthinkable, yet many felt slighted, as though their certainty had been undermined by one man's influence. Still, they dispersed reluctantly, leaving only the lingering echo of their earlier wrath. Eleanor's knees trembled when the Duke turned to her and offered his hand. The gesture felt impossibly gentle after the brutality she had just endured. She accepted it hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper as she thanked him. He studied her face with a quiet solemnity, as though searching for a memory at the edge of recognition. Although he did not provide explanation for his arrival, something in his gaze suggested a connection deeper than mere impulse. Without further discussion, he escorted her to his horse and helped her mount before swinging up behind her with practiced ease. She felt the warmth of his presence through the thin layers of her gown, an unfamiliar sensation that made her heart quicken. The journey from the square to the old Ashcombe estate on the outskirts of Brindlewick unfolded through a blur of cold air and winding paths. Eleanor remained silent, uncertain whether questions would be welcomed or considered impertinent. The Duke offered no conversation either, though the firmness of his arms as he steadied her on the horse conveyed an unspoken assurance. When they arrived at the estate, a grand structure partially shrouded by overgrown ivy, she observed its mixture of grandeur and neglect. Certain wings appeared pristine, recently tended, while others bore the weathered marks of long disuse. He assisted her to the ground and guided her inside, where a small staff greeted him with reverence and mild surprise. He instructed his housekeeper, Mrs. Harbury, to prepare a room for Eleanor near the east corridor, where the fires kept warmer. The woman, though startled by the sight of a shivering, mud-stained apothecary's daughter, obeyed without hesitation. As Eleanor warmed her hands by the hearth of the receiving room, the Duke stood at a measured distance, watching her with a contemplative expression. She felt compelled to speak, if only to dispel the oppressive weight of unanswered questions. "Your Grace," she began softly, "I am grateful for your intervention, though I do not understand why you risked so much for my sake." He responded with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Because I know who you are," he said quietly, "and I know you would never betray this country. When word reached me that a woman in Brindlewick was to be executed for aiding a suspected deserter, I rode here as swiftly as I could." Eleanor blinked, puzzled, for she could not recall ever meeting a duke, let alone earning the attention of one. His next words deepened her confusion. "Years ago, during the war, you tended a wounded officer who collapsed near your father's shop. You believed him a mere traveler, yet you saved his life without hesitation. That officer was me." The revelation struck her with unexpected force. She remembered the night vividly. A stranger, cloaked in pain and secrecy, whom she had nursed through fever and infection before he vanished by dawn. She had often wondered whether he survived, never imagining he had been a nobleman in disguise. Her breath caught as she realized the depth of his gratitude, though she remained uncertain whether such gratitude alone could justify the risks he had taken tonight. Before she could speak again, Mrs. Harbury returned with warm broth and blankets, guiding Eleanor to a nearby chamber to rest. The Duke stepped aside, but offered one final reassurance before she left the room. "Until this matter is sorted, you are safe under my protection. Whatever accusations have been thrown at you, I will ensure the truth is known." His voice held a promise that steadied her trembling spirit, though she feared the consequences of becoming indebted to a man of such power. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to a fragile sense of peace, though traces of dread persisted. Mrs. Harbury brought her a modest gown borrowed from a former maid and instructed her to join the Duke for breakfast in the conservatory. The room, filled with winter roses and the glow of pale sunlight, felt strangely removed from the turmoil of the day before. The Duke greeted her with a nod and invited her to sit. Their conversation began cautiously, marked by polite inquiries about her health and comfort. Yet beneath the decorum, Eleanor sensed unspoken tension, an awareness that their situation defied every social expectation. He explained that he had already dispatched a message to the local magistrate demanding a formal inquiry rather than mob justice. Eleanor expressed concern that the villagers would resent his involvement and perhaps retaliate. The Duke dismissed her worry with calm pragmatism, stating that fear made people irrational, but authority could temper their impulses. Still, a faint crease appeared between his brows when he admitted the matter had already reached neighboring parishes. Rumors were spreading that a duke had intervened to save a woman accused of treason, and speculation about their relationship was inevitable. Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. She feared becoming the subject of scandal far more than facing legal inquiry. The Duke, observing her discomfort, softened his expression. "This is not your doing," he said gently. "I shoulder the responsibility for bringing you here. I do not regret the choice." The sincerity in his tone unsettled her, stirring emotions she had no experience managing. She glanced down at her hands, uncertain how to respond without overstepping her place. After breakfast, he led her to a sitting room where a single object rested on the table, a small silver case, polished but clearly old. He gestured for her to open it. Inside lay a pressed sprig of wintergreen, faded but unmistakable. Eleanor recognized it instantly as the same herb she had used during his treatment years earlier. The Duke's voice lowered as he explained that he had carried it with him throughout the war, a reminder that compassion could exist even amid brutality. She felt a tremor of emotion at the thought that something so small had held meaning for him. Before she could fully absorb the sentiment, a sharp knock interrupted them. A footman entered with a sealed letter addressed to the Duke. Upon opening it, he read with a grin set to his jaw. The inquiry had been approved, but rumors now suggested the boy she had aided might have been connected to a larger investigation. Eleanor's heart sank at the renewed uncertainty, but the Duke placed a steadying hand atop the letter and said, "This changes nothing. I will see this matter through to its end." His unwavering resolve filled her with cautious hope. Yet as she looked out the conservatory window toward the distant village, she sensed that their trials were only beginning, for the truth, whatever it proved to be, would demand as much courage as the night he saved her life. The afternoon light slanted across the estate's western corridor, gilding the marble floor as Elena followed Lord Hawthorne toward the music room, her steps quieter than the restless rhythm in her chest. She had agreed to accompany him only after a sleepless night spent interrogating her own reaction to his unexpected gentleness, his sudden shift from cool distance to a warmth that unsettled and intrigued her in equal measure. The conflict between her mistrust and her curiosity gnawed at her, making every moment by his side feel charged with more meaning than she wanted to assign. He walked ahead with an even stride, the back of his coat brushing softly with each movement, yet she sensed the tension he tried to conceal, as though he, too, struggled with something unspoken. When he opened the tall double doors, the scent of polished wood and old sheet music greeted them. He gestured her in with a quiet civility that did not seek to impress, but rather to reassure, and she stepped into the room, her fingers instinctively grazing the edge of the nearest piano. It was a grand instrument, its ebony surface reflecting the fading daylight, and she felt a flutter of nerves as she realized he expected her to play. He noticed her hesitation and offered a faint smile that softened his usually severe features, allowing her to glimpse a man tucked beneath the layers of authority and restraint. That glimpse stirred an uncomfortable warmth in her, one she refused to acknowledge yet could not escape. "You needn't perform," he said gently, his voice carrying none of the command she had come to associate with him. "I only hope you might share something you enjoy. Music reveals more honest truths than conversation ever can." His words were earnest, almost vulnerable, and she found herself lowering onto the piano bench despite the swirl of uncertainty in her stomach. She placed her hands on the keys, letting them hover in indecision before pressing down gently, coaxing a tender note that blossomed into the quiet air. She played a melody her mother once taught her, a tune woven with memories she preferred not to revisit, yet somehow it rose from her hands with a fragile steadiness that surprised her. Hawthorne leaned against a nearby column, his arms loosely crossed, but his gaze remained fixed upon her with an intensity that felt too intimate. She ought to have looked away. Instead, she let the music carry her forward until the room seemed to narrow to only the two of them, as though the estate itself were holding its breath. When the final note faded, he exhaled softly, the sound almost reverent. She felt exposed, as if she had revealed a secret she did not realize she was still guarding. "You play beautifully," he murmured, stepping closer. "But more than that, you play with truth." His compliment unsettled her, not because of the praise itself, but because of how deeply he appeared to mean it. She forced herself to stand, needing distance before her emotions blurred further. Yet when she faced him, his expression had changed, shadowed by an emotion she could not decipher. "I have something I must show you," he said, voice steady but layered with something uncharacteristically heavy. "You deserve honesty before this, whatever it is between us, grows beyond what either of us intended." The words struck her with a jolt. She stood still, feeling the quiet collapse of the moment they had shared, replaced by a sudden dread that tightened in her throat. He motioned toward the opposite door, and she followed him through a narrower passage that spiraled downward, each step colder than the last. The corridor led to a small chamber lit by a single oil lamp. Its walls were lined with boxes, old documents, and ledgers stacked with meticulous order. At the center lay a wooden table where a collection of sealed letters had been arranged with precise deliberation. Hawthorne paused before them, his fingers brushing the edges as though they carried a weight measured in more than paper and wax. She waited, her breath shallow, her heart thudding in the quiet. "These letters," he said slowly, "belong to your father." Her pulse stilled. She felt the world tilt, the floor becoming unsteady beneath her. He continued, watching her carefully, aware of the blow his words were striking. "They concern debts he concealed, debts that bind this estate to yours in ways I believe you were never told." Her chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and unwilling recognition. She reached for one envelope, her hands trembling as she broke the brittle seal. The handwriting was unmistakable, her father's looping script she had not seen since childhood. The letter spoke of financial ruin, of desperate agreements made in secrecy, agreements involving Hawthorne's family and obligations she never imagined existed. She felt the words sinking like stones, reshaping everything she thought she knew. "You think I kept this from you out of cruelty," Hawthorne said quietly. "But I only received them months ago. I delayed telling you because I feared what the truth might cost." His confession carried no defensiveness, only a sincerity that threatened to fracture the fragile wall she had built around her trust. She swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. "Why tell me now?" she managed, her words barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, his eyes unguarded. "Because I couldn't let you believe I sought your company for reasons rooted in obligation or advantage. Whatever expectations once existed, I refused to let them define us." His voice faltered on the last word, as though unsure whether he had the right to claim any connection between them. The tremor in her heartbeat deepened. She turned away, gripping the edge of the table for support, feeling the collision of truth, betrayal, and unexpected tenderness. She had long suspected that her father harbored secrets, but she never imagined they would entangle her future with Hawthorne's in a way that neither of them chose. The revelation should have ignited anger, but instead it kindled a deeper ache, one born from the sudden clarity that Hawthorne trusted her enough to expose what could destroy the fragile understanding forming between them. He took a step closer, but did not touch her, as though afraid any proximity might break her further. "Elena," he said softly, and her name in his voice held a gentleness that made her chest ache. "You're free to walk away from any arrangement our families once imagined. I will not hold you to a single promise built on their faults." The sincerity in his tone left her breathless, not because he released her, but because it revealed the depth of his integrity, an integrity she had long refused to acknowledge. She turned to face him, her eyes stinging despite her resolve to remain composed. "You think it's that simple?" she whispered. "You think I can just step away without wondering what binds you to all this and what binds me to you now?" The last words escaped before she could stop them, dropping into the quiet with a weight neither of them could ignore. His expression tightened, not with triumph, but with an emotion she had not yet learned to name. A long silence stretched between them before he answered. "No," he said softly. "Nothing about this is simple, but I hoped you would let me try to make it right." Something shifted in her then, a fragile yet undeniable movement toward understanding. She didn't forgive him, nor the past they both inherited, but she felt the first stirrings of trust slipping through the cracks of her resistance. She straightened, grounding herself in a calm she did not fully feel. "We will face this," she said quietly, "but not tonight." Her voice held steadiness again, and he nodded, accepting her boundary with a relief that flickered across his features. She moved to the door, pausing only once to glance back at him. The afternoon light no longer reached the lower chamber, yet his figure in the dim glow seemed more human, more vulnerable than ever before. She left with the letters pressed to her chest, the weight of them shaping a future she had not asked for, but one she suddenly felt compelled to understand. And as she reached the staircase leading upward, she realized with a startling certainty that this truth, painful and unexpected, had drawn her further into Hawthorne's world than any kindness or cruelty could have achieved.